Hello, welcome back to economics. This week we're going to be talking about externalities. These are going to be costs and benefits that are impacting people not part of the supply and demand curve. So we're going to look at positive and negative externalities. We're going to look at how this impacts social versus private costs and benefits. And we'll talk about how deadweight loss happens because of over or under production. We'll look at the Coase theorem and property rights and how pollution can be reduced through taxes or carbon credits. Externalities are considered market failures, so their government intervention can actually make markets more efficient. Okay, so external costs and benefits. External, this is the word where externalities comes from. It means it's outside of that supply or demand curve. So it's any activity that generates costs and benefits for people not involved in those activities. So costs and benefits not captured in the market. So if you remember way back the beginning of the semester, we looked at supply and demand, and this represents the people participating in the market. So supply, this is the cost of production in the private market. Demand, this represents the value to buyers. And this is going to be people who are participating in the market. So an externality would be something that's not impacting the people who are buying and selling that thing. So let's say we're looking at flights, airlines. If you have someone who lives by the airport, they are going to have a lot of noise pollution. They're going to have to hear all the planes flying overhead. It's going to be loud. They may have to spend extra money to try to hear less sound. But the idea is that this is an external cost because it's not just impacting the people who are on the planes, and it's not just impacting the people who are selling the tickets. It's impacting people who live nearby. And so typically when we think of externalities, we think of pollution, something where it's not only limited to the people who are participating. So if you think about pollution from manufacturing, it's not like the bad air only goes or hangs around the people who buy those products, right? The bad air might be polluting in the city that it's produced. It might travel to another state or city or country. It might impact the entire world. So externalities are going to be things that are external or outside of our market, people who are not part of those supply and demand curves. So a negative externality is an extra cost to society that's not part of the private market supply function. And a positive externality is an extra benefit to society that's not part of the private market demand function. So you may think of a lot of pros and cons of different markets. Airline travel makes things faster, people can get where they want to go, but that's not a positive externality, right? That's just something that's already part of the demand curve. If you're deciding how much you want to pay for an airline ticket, if you want to drive versus take a plane, you're going to think, oh, I could get there faster. I'm going to save time or, whatever the reasons. To be an externality, it has to impact somebody else who's not using that plane. Okay, so we'll look at some examples in just a minute. And so what we're really doing is we're comparing the marginal social cost and marginal social benefit to the marginal private cost and benefit. So when we're looking at the costs, this is going to be impacted on the supply curve. And typically, this is going to be looking at negative externalities. So negative externalities have an extra cost to society. So we're going to say that a negative externality has a greater marginal social cost than the private cost to produce that item. And this is important because it means that these markets are going to be overproducing. If it costs the company $5, they're going to decide how many to produce based on $5, based on that price, the sales price. So let's say the market selling price is $7 and your private cost to produce is $5. Firms are going to say, yes, we should produce this, right? They're going to make a positive economic profit. But if we take into account the marginal social cost, maybe like the total, so we'll just say social cost. So this includes private and outside, is $8. Well, now if it's only selling for $7, we shouldn't do this, right? Because this is technically a loss. Okay. So we're going to see with negative externalities that we are overproducing. We're actually selling quantities that have a higher cost than what that extra benefit is. So we assume that this selling for $7 represents the demand function and the value our people are getting. And then if the social cost is $8, that's a mismatch. We don't want to do that. The benefit side, we are going to say is going to impact the demand curve. So what marginal social benefit versus marginal private benefits, we're going to look at the demand curve, and then this is typically going to be for positive externalities. So the idea that positive externality, there's a greater marginal social benefit compared to the private benefit. And in this case, we would say that our markets are going to be underproducing because there's these extra benefits to society that the individual buyer, the individual person on the demand curve is not benefiting from. So when they decide, are they going to take an airplane? Are they going to get a vaccine? They're thinking about their own personal benefits, right? What's my cost? What's my benefit? And there may be a larger benefit to society, but that's not how we decide what to do. Okay, so let's look at some examples. So let's say we have honeybees who are next to a fruit orchard and a school. So on one side, we've got these lovely fruit trees. I don't know, apples. I don't actually know what bees pollinate. We'll just say they do apples. And on the other side, we have an elementary school with little kids. And in the middle, we have this beehive. However you draw a beehive. Pretend like I know how to draw. Okay, so I've got this beehive. We're actually going to get positive and negative externalities to the beehive. So the owner of the beehive is producing honey. Say they're producing honey and they sell their honey. So what they're doing is they're looking at the market for honey and saying, okay, prices are here. I'm going to produce this much honey. No, 100 bottles of honey selling for $5 each. So I need, I don't know, 3 beehives to make this amount of honey. Sorry to those of you who know lots about honey production. This is probably not correct, but just pretend. Okay, so 3 beehives. So they put their beehives here. This area was open. They actually need it to be near an orchard or some kind of other very heavily planted area because bees need pollen to make honey. Well, there's a positive externality for the orchard owner in that the bees are actually pollinating the fruit trees. So now they don't have to go buy their own bees or they're going to get better results. They're not benefiting from the sale of the honey because someone else owns the honey, but they do get this positive externality of having the bees pollinate their orchards. The negative externality is that the bees are also going over to the school and they are stinging the kids. So the kids are getting bee stings. This is negative. They're not being paid for the honey, so it's not in their benefit, right? The guy who owns the beehive probably also gets some bee stings, but he factors that into like if he wants to produce this or not, right? That's part of his own cost. The kids getting stung, it's not part of it. So what do we do? Should we have the beehive? Should we put regulations like it has to be a certain distance away from areas? Do we just say it's a free for all? Everyone can produce what they want where they want, and if the kids from the school don't like it, they can buy bee suits to wear to school. I don't know. So we'll just get into some of those things, property rights, how we sort of solve some of these problems. But you can have positive and negative externalities from the same market. So each of the items below is considered to have an externality. I want you to pause for just a minute and think about if it's positive or negative or maybe both for each of these things. Remember, you're not thinking about the things that impact the actual market, but the things that impact outside markets. So you're going to think about education, airports, and vaccines. So, for instance, like vaccines, a positive and negative externality needs to be for people who didn't get the vaccine or just people in the broader community. So you're not thinking about, oh, well, the cost of a vaccine, I have to pay for it. It might hurt my arm from the needle, but then I'm going to be protected from diseases. You're not thinking about the stuff that would create the demand curve. You're thinking about like, how does this impact people who did not get the vaccine or who are maybe benefited from other people getting the vaccine, even if they did. Or airports, it's not the people who own the planes or the people who are flying on them, but maybe the people who are impacted in surrounding areas. Same thing for education. You're not thinking about the costs and benefits to the person who's going to school and getting educated. You're thinking about the costs and benefits to society. Okay, so pause here. Think about this for just a minute. There's lots of possible answers, but just see if you can come up with a couple for each of these. Okay, so you may have thought of a lot. So education oftentimes is considered to have positive externalities because it's beneficial for society. When you have more educated people in the community, it means better jobs, less crime, all sorts of stuff. And not just for the people there, but let's say, I don't know, this person right here, they never went to school, but they do have a job in the community. And if a lot more people are educated, maybe the value of those jobs go up. Maybe this person's wages increase, or they have access to more services, or other things that are related. Airports. So you may could think of um, positive or negative. Let me give you an example of a negative externality. We already talked about this one a little bit, like noise pollution. So if someone lives near an airport, they have to hear lots of planes flying over. They're not being paid by the airlines for that. They just have to live in potentially worse conditions. Vaccines, you might also think of positive and negative externalities. One positive example would be herd immunity. And the idea is that for some vaccines, if enough people have the vaccination, it basically stops the disease from spreading and it protects people who either can't get the vaccine or don't have it. So, a lot of times babies can't get vaccines for certain things, but if enough other people are vaccinated around them, the disease can't really spread from person to person and it won't get to them. So we do see some things like measles basically had gone away, but now as people are being less vaccinated, some of those diseases are coming back. So you could definitely think of positive and negative externalities probably for all of these things. Feel free to stop by office hours or send me a message if you want to talk about any of your answers. I just gave you a couple of examples for each of these. So externalities lead to inefficiencies because our markets are over or under producing. So back when we talked about economic surplus, we said this market equilibrium is going to be our most efficient point because it's maximizing that surplus. And we talked about price controls and other government interventions that actually made markets less efficient. But in this case, our private market equilibrium is inefficient because it's not really operating at our social optimum. So we're going to assume that the supply is the marginal cost curve and demand is going to represent the marginal benefit curve. And the idea is that we're not allocating resources effectively, leading to over or under production. Okay, so I'll come back to that. All right, so if we have, this is our private market benefits and costs. If we have a negative externality, our marginal cost, it doesn't like me writing up here. Okay, write it over here. Marginal cost, social plus private is here. And really, this is showing us that we're overproducing. We actually should be producing at a lower amount. So why should we be producing there? Well, this actually has a higher cost to society than what our buyers are paying. So in this case, let's say it's for an airline ticket and people are paying $300. But at this quantity, when we look at our true cost to society, it might actually be costing $400. And so we would say that this is inefficient because there's this extra $100 that our buyers do not have to pay, right? Buyers aren't paying. This is not a cost for producers. And so they're going to say, sure, $300, I'm going to fly more. If they had to pay $400, a lot of those people wouldn't buy that ticket. Okay. And so we're actually overproducing. And we'll get into deadweight loss in just a second. So, okay, negative externalities. So think about things like pollution. Here's a lovely picture of looks like LA, some big city where it looks nice. It's a pretty picture, nice sunset, but you can see there's a lot of stuff in the air. It's not a clear view. and that would be like air pollution. We can have noise pollution, you can have people throwing trash all over the place, and the optimal amount for society is not zero. So when we look over at this graph up here, let's say our current market is producing 800 airline tickets a day, but our optimum is 600. 600 is still going to cause air pollution. The plain fuel burning causes air pollution. But we still like having that product, and we decide we're willing to have some kind of level of pollution. Countries create target levels for acceptable pollution. And I mean, like 0 would be better. It would be great to have no air pollution, no water pollution, no trash everywhere. So why isn't the country target 0? Why don't we say 0 air pollution, 0 carbon, 0 whatever it is? Well, the costs are going to be really high. If you remember back, I think we talked about recycling cans a few chapters ago, and the more and more cans you collect, the longer it takes per can. So the first chunk of cans, it's easy to find. They're laying all over the place. They're on the top of trash cans. It's really easy to access. But then there's some that are like buried really down deep in the trash. Maybe we'd have to have the city like sort through all of the garbage to do all of the recycling. And there's a trade-off. So if we're using our resources for recycling, then we don't have resources for something else. So if we use all of our resources to eliminate pollution, we're not going to have resources for something else. And so we're going to have some socially optimum level of pollution, and that's going to be okay. And we're going to account for that in our cost curve. So externalities are inefficient. They cause deadweight loss. And a negative externality, we have a market that's overproducing. So here on this graph, we have supply is equal to our marginal cost. And then we have this other curve up here called MSC. This is the marginal social cost. So this is going to be how your book looks at it. And then down here we have MEC, which is basically the marginal externality cost. And this line right here is just the difference between MSC and MC. So it's that extra cost to society. And so you can see that it's added on here. So externality and deadweight loss. This is similar to how we looked at deadweight loss before. It's going to be that difference between where we should be and where we are. So similar to monopoly. So the social cost is where we say we should be. And the private market is where we are without regulation or fees or other things. Okay, so how we calculate the deadweight loss is we take where we are, we go up to the marginal social cost, because this is what cost we actually are paying for that, and then all the way over to that triangle that ends in where we should be. Okay, so we get this deadweight loss over here. Notice it's on the opposite side of where we saw deadweight loss in monopolies, and that's because this market is overproducing. In a monopoly market, we have underproduction. So monopolies let me write that better. Underproduce. And so we get a triangle that points the other direction. In this case, we're overproducing. So our deadweight loss is from where we should be over to the right. And we calculate this the same way as we did the other ones, like 1/2 base time height. I don't think we're not going to actually calculate it this time. I think we just want to know that it exists. But if we do have any calculations, I'll make sure you guys have straight lines so that it's easier to do. Otherwise, you have to use calculus, which I think is super fun. Some of you might love taking integrals, doing derivatives, but you got to take some of the intermediate classes to do that. Positive externality is going to be a market that's underproducing. So this is going to look more like what we saw in a monopoly. So we'll have some kind of marginal cost curve. We're going to have our demand curve. And then we're going to have the social demand curve, which includes all those extra benefits. And so our market here, let's say it's producing 50, and our social optimum is actually 75. So in this case, our market is underproducing. We would prefer as a society to be at 75, but we're only at 50. We go up to the demand curve to see that true benefit that we're getting from this. And then you go all the way over to that optimal point, and then this triangle is deadweight loss. So we want to be here. We should be at our social optimum. Instead, our private market is underproducing. So we get this deadweight loss because we could have more surplus. So both positive and negative externalities cause deadweight loss. On the negative side, we have this extra cost to society. And on the benefit side, positive externality, we have this extra benefit that we're not getting, right? We're missing out on a benefit. So externalities are considered market failures, means the market is not producing at the actual efficient level, and government intervention can make them more efficient. So for a positive externality, they can try to entice people to do more of that. So let's say vaccines have a positive externality. The government might say free vaccines. They did that during COVID. The state of California was like, not enough people are being vaccinated. Let's pay people. We'll give you $50 if you come get a vaccine. Well, we make the vaccine free. Still not everyone's getting it. We'll pay you to get it. Like, they did all sorts of stuff. And so markets with externalities are markets where we may actually want government intervention. They can make the markets more efficient. Now, we do need to consider like the size of that deadweight loss. If it's really large, government intervention will be beneficial. If it's a small deadweight loss, it might not be helpful because there is still a cost to government intervention. It's not going to be free. The Coase theorem, so this is named after someone, so Coase is his name, and he did some work and looked at how, like, if you assign property rights, we can actually get efficient outcomes. So if you took noise pollution and you said people have the right to quiet, the airlines would have to pay people to make noise in the air. They would have to either pay to get their houses soundproof, or they would just have to compensate them for that negative noise. If we have, well, we'll talk about that later. So the idea with the Coase theorem is that people can negotiate the purchase and the sale of rights to perform activities that cause externalities and always arrive at efficient solutions. So your book has a couple examples of this. Some of them are much longer. I'm going to put a short example in the slides, but take a look at your book for the longer example as well. In this example, we have a beer brewer and a plant nursery that are located near each other. So the beer brewer is producing air pollutants, so from the fermenting or whatever process for making beer, and it hurts the plants. So the plants don't like this stuff. It just makes them not grow as well. Some of them are unhealthy. And we want to know, will the beer brewery voluntarily purchase an air filter to help the nursery? Probably not. So in economics, at least in the earlier classes, we don't have a value for altruism. Typically, people aren't just doing things to help someone else. They look at their costs and benefits in deciding, like, do they want to operate? And if someone else has a negative impact from it, like, oh, well, they can go do something else. Now, in some of the later classes, if you get into some more advanced economics, we can build in altruism and caring for other people into these models. But for now, we're just going to have a table where we look at, like, how much are they going to get with polluting and we're not polluting. In this case, there's an air filter that the beer brewery can put on their, I don't know, whatever's spewing out the air. They can put this on to keep that bad stuff, like, inside or captured so it doesn't impact the plants. But it's going to cost them money, and maybe they even produce less. So when there's no air filter, the beer factory is going to make $300 a day. And when they do have the air filter, most likely because of the extra cost, they're only going to be making $250 a day. So naturally, like, they don't want to put on the air filter because it's going to cost them money. They're not going to have as much profit, and maybe potentially they may want to go out of business. For the nursery, without the air filter, they make $150 a day. And with the air filter, they make $250 a day because their plants are more healthy. They're not dying. They are able to sell much more. So obviously, the nursery wants the air filter. They're going to make a lot more money, and the beer brewer doesn't. Okay, so what is our social optimum? What does society want? In this case, we're going to look at the total profits. So without the air filter, our total profits are 450, and with the air filter, our total profits are 500. So we would say that our social optimum is going to be with an air filter because that's creating the most profit for society, most profit for our group. Okay, so how much would the nursery potentially be willing to pay for the brewery to install an air filter? And what is the minimum they would accept? So the beer brewer, they're looking at their profits going down to $250 a day with the air filter. So they're going to want a minimum of $50 to put in an air filter because they don't want to lose money. And the nursery, their profits would go from 150 to 250. So the most they would be willing to pay is $100 because anything up over $100 they would just be losing money. So because the minimum is 50 and the maximum is 100, potentially they can negotiate and come to a solution that's going to be better for both of them. And maybe they say we'll pay you that extra $50 to put in the air filter, so they'll get 50, they'll still be at 300, and now after that extra cost they'll be at 200. Maybe they negotiate $80, but it has to be something above 50 and something less than 100. Okay, so if the nursery pays $60 to the brewer, will they install the air filter? Yes. So if they offer $60, they would say yes. They're going to end up with $310. And the nursery is going to end up with $190. And this is going to be better for both of them than the no air filter situation. Whoever owns the property rights is going to get the greater benefit. So if people have the right to pollute, in this case, the nursery is going to pay the brewer to put in the air filter. If they have the right to clean air, then the brewery is just going to have to put the air filter in. The nursery won't have to pay them anything, and they get the greater benefit. So whoever owns the property right is going to benefit more. But either way, you can get to an efficient outcome if you say there's a right to pollute or there's a right to clean air, as long as there's this difference in profits. So let's say for some reason, with the air filter, this one, drops to 150, and the nursery's profit only went up to 250. Now the no air filter situation would be our social optimum because it produces $450 versus 400. In this case, our efficient solution is going to be no air filter, and there's not going to be any way to make both people better off to get to this air filter situation. So we also have to think about where those profits are, what's the cost of reducing pollution, and who owns the property rights. So there's an example in California, in Irwindale, from the sriracha plant. There was an issue with spicy air. This actually happened a couple different times. We are going to talk about the incident in 2013. So in 2010, Huifeng Foods moved to Irwindale. They wanted to increase their production space. There was a big open area in Irwindale, and they could produce more sriracha, make more money. The city offered them an interest-only loan for 10 years as an incentive. So come move here, you can borrow money, build your factory, and you're not going to have to pay any interest for 10 years. But in 2013, the residents were complaining that the factory was creating spicy air and it was causing problems for many residents and their children. So the city sued the sriracha plant and said, "We're threatening to declare you a public nuisance if you do not put in air filters and fix this spicy air problem." And Huifeng Foods countersued and said, "No, you can't do that if you incentivize us to come here. We meet all the regulations, like the air is not spicy, like it's fine." So in 2001, they were making $12 million per year, and by 2012, they were making $60 million per year. Now, this is not profits, this is just total revenue. So they're able to sell a lot more sriracha than before. And I think probably 2013, whenever they looked at the profits, they were making about $2 million per year. And the city was making $250,000 per year from the factory being here. So, how much would they be willing to pay? Well, we're not quite sure how much the air filter is. But if the city's making $250,000, Sriracha's making $2 million. It's gonna hope it needs to be somewhere in between there for it to work out. Okay, so what is the outcome? Well, the lawsuit eventually was dropped. The Sriracha plant installed better ventilation filters, and they stopped paying the $250,000 to the city. So basically, they said, okay, we'll install the air filters, but the city is going to not get this payment anymore. Good outcome, not good outcome. It depends, right? So there's a lot of other benefits to the city. There's a lot of jobs in the area. They might not have been able to kick them out or do those things based on the contracts and other things that they had. So this way, like, the air is not as spicy. Sriracha still gets to be there. They're going to lose some amount of money from having to install the expensive air filters, but it's going to be compensated partially or fully by that amount of city profits. I will post a link to a couple of videos about this later on the page if you want to watch more about this. So, how do we fix the problem of externalities? Sometimes we can have negotiations between producing and affected groups. So, the residents who are facing spicy air could try to negotiate with the sriracha plant. But oftentimes, this is really difficult when you have a lot of people maybe affected. So, if you're talking about like air pollution, there might be one factory somewhere, but that air travels all over the entire world, and you can't really negotiate that way, right? It's not always practical. It comes with a lot of costs. It does not work when there's a large group of people impacted. Laws and regulations oftentimes force more efficient outcomes. So they have laws where you have to have quiet mufflers or catalytic converter on your car. There's fines for littering. If you compare different states, like California has much higher requirements for pollution from cars. So when you look at the price of buying like a catalytic converter, it's going to be higher in California because they have stricter regulations. It has to remove more pollution than if you're driving around other parts of the country. Sometimes there's going to be taxes and subsidies to fix the problem. So the government might tax markets with negative externalities. We're going to add a carbon tax or pollution tax. We're going to add something to try to make the market more efficient. And when they do this, so laws and regulations or taxes, it shifts that private market supply curve. And if they calculate it correctly, it's going to shift all the way over to the marginal social cost, right? The idea is we want to internalize those costs so they're not external anymore. If it's causing $1 per unit in pollution to society, add a $1 tax, and now the company's paying for it, which means they're more likely to actually produce at that optimal level. They're going to subsidize markets with positive externalities. So the idea is we want people to produce more. So you take that demand curve. A subsidy is the opposite of a tax. So the government might pay people to do this activity more. That's going to increase the demand curve, increase that reservation price, and shift it over so that hopefully they're now producing at or closer to the social optimum. So people pollute based on explicit costs. And it's not that they don't care about the environment. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but they're looking at how much is it going to cost me to produce this? How much can I sell it for? What's my profit going to be? So we need to change incentives by making those costs explicit for firms. So if it's harming air quality, if it's harming the economy, if it's harming individual people, you add that cost in, it shifts the curve, and then now we're producing at more optimal levels. One potential problem with this is that even though, the government may add a tax and they're making pollution at a more optimal level, they're not going to oftentimes directly compensate the people who are impacted. So even though it gets us to that social optimum, the money usually goes toward the government and it may not necessarily benefit the people who are most directly impacted. Sometimes the government will use emissions standards. So they'll say, okay, cars can only pollute this much. They may give pollution credits where people can auction or trade. So they'll say, okay, we want pollution to be 12. So we have two companies. We're going to give them each 6 credits, and they can each pollute 6, but they have to cut their pollution in half, or they can buy and sell their credits. We'll look at an example in this in a couple slides. Sometimes there's emission fees. So it's a tax on how much pollution comes out of a car or how much pollution comes out of a factory or production process, or just taxes. So we're going to have a percentage tax on total revenue, how much money you make. There's different ways of doing these. All of these things are trying to somehow take that cost to society and turn it into a cost for the firm. So having auctions or trades where you issue a certain amount of credits is going to end up with more efficient outcomes than just having standard taxes or fees. When you have like an auction, or if companies are allowed to buy and sell their credits, they're going to figure out their own costs, their own comparative advantage, and then they end up trading with each other. Or the people who need the credits the most are going to buy them from the auction, or they'll buy them from whoever is selling. And the people with lower pollution costs will just reduce their pollution. So this way we can reduce the same amount of pollution, but for the lowest possible cost. Okay, so it's going to be most efficient. We'll still end up with the same outcome. The same amount of pollution is reduced, but it's going to be at a lower cost. And taxing and fees, it requires that the government is accurate in identifying each firm's cost and their benefits of pollution. And you can add a tax to a company, but if you're wrong about the slope of their supply curve, they may just keep polluting the same amount. So if the goal is to actually reduce the pollution, then it takes a lot more work on the government's part to do a good job. If you issue credits or emission standards, like you can only pollute this amount, you're going to end up with better outcomes. So oftentimes we're going to see carbon taxes because carbon dioxide is possibly a contributing factor to climate change. But there's still a lot of deep uncertainty about future and potential effects. Governments don't really quite know. They're just like, well, we'll target this amount, we'll target this temperature. They're kind of just guessing. They're picking things that they can measure. Currently, there's a lot of carbon taxes on emissions, gas taxes, anything that produces any activities that produce carbon. And we'll see that those taxes do reduce stuff. So high taxes on gas reduce the demand for gas and gas complements. Increases demand for substitutes such as like electric vehicles or high MPG vehicles. Taxes increase prices, which make previously expensive alternatives viable. So let's say electric vehicles are better for the environment. I have done no studies on this, so I cannot definitively say. But let's just say if an electric vehicle is better, but it costs twice as much money, people are still going to choose the cheaper fuel vehicles. But if you start taxing emissions, it makes those fuel vehicles more expensive. And then the relative price of electric vehicles doesn't look so bad. And if you tax it enough, maybe they could even be the same price, or maybe electric vehicles could be cheaper, and then people will switch over. Now, customers are not going to be happy about this because they're going to be paying a lot more money than before. But it is a way of sort of moving markets. Okay, so let's do an example using pollution credits. So this is a Coase theorem. We're gonna assign property rights. We'll get to an efficient outcome. Firms are gonna be allowed to buy and sell credits to get to the most efficient outcome. So the government is gonna decide a particular level of pollution. And what they're gonna do is they're going to issue credits. These are like permits for polluting. So if the government, we're just doing this in units. So this has, each firm has up to 6 units of pollution. And then the government's going to give them a certain number of credits and say you can keep polluting that many, but you have to cut the rest of your pollution. And if you don't have a credit for it, you can't pollute that amount. So firms who reduce pollution cheaper are going to sell their credits to the more expensive polluters. And this way, we're going to get the same level of pollution reduction, but just at a more efficient rate. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by comparing marginal costs between firms to decide who is going to buy or sell. Then we're going to figure out what the minimum and maximum prices are going to be and decide if they're going to sell and how many. So here we've got two firms. We have McBurger and Jack's Fries. And currently they are each polluting 6. The government says we need to cut pollution in half, and each firm is given 3 pollution credits. Okay, so I'm going to draw a line here on my table under 3. That means they have to reduce pollution by 3, but they can keep polluting the other 3. Now, when they're looking at their cost of pollution, right, they can reduce 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And I drew the line under 3 because they're not going to reduce more than they have to. It's going to cost more money and it's going to hurt profits. So in this scenario, the starting point is that they reduce 3 and then they use their credits for 4, 5, and 6. Credit. And the other firm's going to do the same. So they're going to reduce 1, 2, and 3, and then they're going to use their credits to keep polluting for 4, 5, and 6. We see that we have a total cost of pollution for each firm and a marginal cost of pollution for each firm. And if you notice from looking at this table, Jack's Fries, it's going to cost them more to reduce pollution than it is McBurger. So Jack's Fries, for whatever reason, their process is just going to be more expensive. They maybe have to have different air filters. They have to change the shape of their building. I don't know what it is. It just is going to cost them more. And so they might actually benefit from trading. And so what we want to see, is will they trade with each other? Okay, so we're going to start at this line, and we're going to say that McBurger would be the one to sell credits, and Jack's Fries is the one who's going to potentially buy credits. And that's because of their marginal cost. McBurger is cheaper than Jack's Fries. So for McBurger, if they sell their credits, it's going to impact 4, 5, and 6. So if they sell their first credit, they're going to have to reduce 4 units of pollution, and it's going to cost them an extra $18. So the minimum they'd be willing to sell their credit for is going to be $18. And if Jack buys this credit, he's going to use it for that third unit of pollution, which is currently costing him $45. So the max he'd be willing to spend on that credit is $45 because that's what he's already having to pay to reduce pollution. So we're going to say that yes, they're going to be able to negotiate this credit because the minimum for McBurger is 18, the maximum for Jack is 45. Maybe they talk, they decide, and they say, all right, we're going to sell it for $23. Okay, I just made that up. Okay, so $23, they both are going to say yes. McBurger is going to end up with an extra $5 of profit that he didn't have. And Jack is going to end up with an extra $22 of profit because he only has to spend 23 instead of 45. And then they're going to do that with the other credits too. So if McBurger sells his second credit, it's going to cost him 28. So the minimum he'd be willing to sell it for is 28. And Jack, they would use it on this second unit of pollution. So instead of reducing that second one, they would use a credit. Currently, they are paying $38. So that's the most they'd be willing to spend. So we're going to say yes, they can negotiate some fee in between here. Maybe they say, I don't know, we'll sell this one for $30. Okay. And then McBurger gets an extra $2 and Jack saves $8. Maybe they negotiate 37, whatever it is, but it has to be somewhere in that range. And then the third credit, okay, so if they're going to sell all 3, then McBurger has to reduce that last unit of pollution also. Currently, it's going to cost them $44 to do that. So that would be the lowest they'd be willing to take for that third credit. And then Jack is going to use that credit on his first unit of pollution, which he's currently paying $33 to reduce. So the most he'd be willing to pay is $33. Are they going to be able to negotiate the sale of this credit? No, they're not going to. Okay. So they would stop there, and we would say that the outcome is that McBurger is going to reduce 5 units of pollution, and then they're going to use 1 credit. And McBurger is going to buy 2 credits so that they are going to reduce by 1, and then they're going to use a total of 5 credits. So the 3 they started out with plus the extra 2 that they purchased. So this goes back to that cost theorem idea. Like if there's a difference between my value and your value, we can possibly negotiate something to get to a more efficient outcome. And we say that this is more efficient because we're reducing pollution at all of the lowest marginal costs. So this outcome right here, where they bought and sold 2 credits, that gives us that lowest total cost of pollution. Okay, so take a look at this. There should be an example in your homework as well. Work on this and send me a message or pop in office hours. Let me know if you guys have any questions.